Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Today on CityCast Boise. Summer travel is here, but finding cheap flights out of our city can be tough. We aren't an airline hub, which makes international trips feel daunting and expensive. But according to Scott Keyes of the travel website Going, there's killer flight deals happening here all the time if you just know how to look. So we're resharing Scott's conversation with our executive producer, Frankie Barnhill. They have can't-miss tips for your next big adventure. It's Tuesday, June 18th. I'm Lindsay Van Allen, and this is what Boise's talking about. Scott, thanks for joining us on CityCast Boise today.
Sure, my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
You know, the Boise airport's not a major hub. That's obvious. It does make it more difficult to find cheap flights, although with more and more people traveling through our airport. We spoke with the Boise airport director in January, and she was telling us about some upcoming changes and some new flights that are exciting coming up this year. But does that make it more difficult, the fact that we're not a hub?
It does, in the sense that cheap flights are largely a byproduct of competition. The single biggest driver of how many cheap flights you see on a route is just how much competition there is between airlines. With more competition, more airlines, more flights, you tend to see cheaper fares. And of course, the opposite is true as well. That's the bad news. Here's the good news. Well, a city like Boise or a city like Dayton, my home airport growing up, while they get fewer cheap flights than major cities, San Francisco, Chicago, New York, I would actually argue that the small cities get the best cheap flights. They get fewer of them, but they get better cheap flights. And here's why. Take a flight to Paris. The normal price for a flight from, let's call it San Francisco to Paris is going to be something like $800 round trip. And so when that price drops to $400 round trip, as it did last week, folks in San Francisco are saving $400 on that flight. It's a great, wonderful. Save $400, it's great. For folks in Boise, that flight from Boise to Paris is usually going to cost more like $1,500 round trip. So when that flight drops to $400 or even $500 round trip, you're saving $1,000 off normal flight prices, which is something that would be literally impossible for folks in San Francisco unless they're not only getting a free flight, but also a check for a few $100s from the airplane. That's never going to happen. So for folks in Boise, even though you have fewer to pick from, when those cheap flights do pop up, I would argue they're even more valuable than when they are popping up from the larger cities.
So you're telling me that on occasion, there might be a flight that takes me from Paris to Boise, obviously not direct, for like $400 or $500. That occurs every once in a while?
Not only does that occur every once in a while, that is occurring right now. I went and checked, what cheap flights exist out of Boise right now. Understanding, look, it changes every single day. The cheap flights pop up, they disappear. Right now, there is a flight from Boise to this beautiful island off the coast of England called Jersey. That's where New Jersey, of course, is named after. Jersey in the United Kingdom. Flights from Boise to Jersey for $585 round trip. This is on full service airline, on American Airlines, British Airways. And it's not one of these that's, 40 hours or 5 stops. It goes Boise to Dallas, a short layover, Dallas to London, and then London to Jersey. That flight exists right now for $585 round trip. And it's those types of deals that are popping up and disappearing all the time when we want to make sure that, folks don't miss out when the great deals like that do pop up, because it just pains me physically when folks overpay for their flights, when they pay $1,500 to fly to Europe when they could be getting that for $600 or $500.
Okay, this Jersey flight that you're mentioning,
mentioning to this island, this British island, sounds lovely. Of course, you're having multiple stops along the way, but so does a connecting flight, is it unavoidable if, and does it mean that the total price ticket will be more expensive? Because in theory, it's like if you're stopping a lot, you would kind of think like, oh, that's going to be more expensive overall.
Sure. So first, it is unavoidable if you want to travel internationally from Boise. There just are no international flights out of Boise Airport right now, unfortunately. So if you want to travel even to Canada or Mexico, you're going to have a connection. The funny thing is, though, that doesn't necessarily mean that flights are more expensive, and in fact, can actually cut the opposite way. Folks will generally pay a premium for a nonstop flight. If you live in Seattle and you want to fly to Paris, a flight from Seattle to Paris, let's say it's going for $600 round trip, but a flight from Seattle to New York to Paris might only be $450 round trip. That same logic, though, applies if you're flying out of Boise, where you can't get a direct nonstop flight to Paris. You're going to have to connect somewhere. But sometimes that can actually mean a cheaper flight. You might fly Boise to Seattle and then Seattle to Paris. And that flight may actually be cheaper than the Seattle to Paris flight.
That is so wild to me. I mean, it's just so fascinating how it's the same flight, Seattle to Paris, but there's this Boise to Seattle element that makes it less expensive.
It really takes everything we think we know about consumer behavior and flips it on its head. Some people actually even will try to use the fact that airlines will price those nonstop flights higher as a way to get around expensive flights. This is something called hidden city ticketing. You'll often hear or refer to as skip lagging.
Oh, I've heard of this a little bit. What is that again?
So the idea is, let's say you want to fly to Chicago. You search for flights from Boise to Chicago, and they're $300 round trip. But then you go ahead and search for a flight from Boise to Milwaukee. And Boise to Milwaukee via Chicago costs only $200. And so what you do instead is you've booked that flight Boise, Chicago, Milwaukee, but then you just go ahead and get off in Chicago and don't catch your connecting flight.
Airlines hate that, I'm sure.
The airlines hate it, and they actually throw a few wrenches in there to try to prevent you from doing it, including the fact that if you miss that Chicago to Milwaukee flight, the rest of your itinerary automatically gets canceled out. So you can only do this, for instance, on a one-way flight. You can't do it on a round trip. Otherwise, your flight home, you're going to show up at the airport and find that you no longer have a ticket. So this is not a beginner tactic, but this is one way that folks who are more experienced try to take advantage of airline pricing tactics.
Weighing in with soybeans and a baby show straight out of Norburn, Missouri, we have Soybean Festival. From Hayward, Wisconsin, at 73 years young with the world's largest muskie statue, put it together for Muskie Fest. Finally, packing a punch with fire dancing and a pet costume contest, the Roseau, Minnesota Fall Harvest Fest. One of these festivals could win $100,000 in the Cenex Hometown Throwdown. You decide. Cast your vote at CenexHometownThrowdown.com. Cenex, powered locally.
So let's talk a little bit more about the Boise airport specifically and kind of the landscape for flights and prices right now. So the Idaho Statesman recently reported that on average airfare is up like $125 per ticket at the Boise airport. And of course, we've seen spikes in airfare across the country, but this is one of the biggest in the country, actually. What do you make of that? And is this something that you're seeing across the country? And do you think is it going to get any better, or is this kind of the new normal?
There's a couple things happening here. With respect to Boise specifically, what I think is going on was there was a real surge in interest, demand, especially right as the pandemic started to recede, I think a few years ago.
Right. The revenge travel thing. Yeah.
Exactly. But also especially to sort of more Western outdoorsy travel.
Sure.
A big surge in interest to places like Montana, Wyoming, Idaho. And so that certainly led to a spike in prices, especially as airlines were struggling to keep up with the number of flights. Airfare, though, since May 2022 has been falling. Airfare today, when you look at the average airfare, is down 23% compared to that peak. And it's continued to fall. It's down 9% over the past 12 months. It's actually cheaper today than it was in February of 2020, and that's not even adjusting for inflation. So I think airfare, because it is so volatile, because it is always changing for seemingly no rhyme or reason, and because it's something that if you want to travel more than a state or two away, you almost always have to buy a flight. It's this thing that we need, but we can't seem to grasp how it operates, and it seems like it's always expensive, and I think leads us to always think, well, it's always getting more expensive. And one of my life missions is to try to convince folks that airfare is actually getting way cheaper. That airfare has gotten significantly cheaper over the past decade, that we have been living in what I call the golden age of cheap flights, and that the number of great deals popping up is unlike anything we've ever seen before. I'll rattle off just a couple of the best deals that I've seen out of Boise in the past few years. And these are all 100%, full service airlines, deals that Going members were able to purchase. So going from Boise to, let me just pick a few at random here, Boise to Athens for $367 round trip.
What?
Boise to Dublin for $332 round trip. Boise to Madrid in Spain for $295 round trip.
Oh my gosh.
Costa Rica, $207 round trip. Like, these types of deals are absolutely popping up.
Yeah. Are there any deals out of Boise for domestic destinations? I mean, yeah, like I'll see like Alaska's doing deals, to Portland, like $50 one way kind of thing. Those are pretty standard. So that's kind of what we can expect is those, especially the Northwest destinations.
Certainly. Look, I mean, the cheapest place is always going to be to fly are places like Seattle, Denver, Los Angeles, Vegas. Those are all available right now under $200 round trip out of Boise. Those sometimes get quite a bit cheaper, oftentimes under $100 round trip when there's a sale. But again, remembering that because of that volatility of airfare, if you search today and you're hoping to go to Los Angeles and fares are $175, $200, you say, look, maybe I'm not going in the middle of summer, maybe it'll get cheaper. There's a decent chance that it will. And so oftentimes the best strategy for getting that cheap domestic flight or cheap international flight is patience, is booking, making sure you start searching early. Don't wait till the last minute to book, but oftentimes patience and not assuming that today's airfare is going to be tomorrow's airfare, but instead remembering that prices go up and prices go down, and you just need to book it one time. It doesn't matter. Once you've booked it, doesn't matter if it goes up after that. You already locked in the lower price.
I would love to learn a little bit more about your business, about Going and how it works exactly. I mean, yeah, you're a professional cheap flight finder. So tell me how this works a little bit.
Certainly. So the way that Going works is when you sign up, you tell us your home airport, presumably Boise, and then we get to work searching all day, every day for cheap flights out of Boise. When those cheap flights pop up, like we talked about that $575 round trip flight to Jersey in the United Kingdom that is available right now, we send you an email, say, look, hey, we found this great deal. Here it is. Here's the airlines. Here's the dates it's available. Here's the price. Here's how long we think it's going to last. And here's a sample search to get you started if you want to book it.
So I read that you're thinking about some specific customers in one case. I read this in a recent article, specifically teachers. And I think that was an interesting comment you made in this particular article because, we're talking about, you kind of like this Jersey example, right? Mm-hmm. Someone would need to jump on that today. And it's a time-constrained thing. It's probably a window of time in which they could take this trip that when the ticket would need to be booked. Mm-hmm. And of course, for some folks, that's great because maybe they have a more flexible schedule or they're able to just jump on a plane. Maybe they can work remotely and so they can be working while they're on the trip or something like that. But so many people, that's just not realistic. And I thought teachers is the perfect example. Budget constrained, clearly, and time constrained. Like they're only available to go on a European vacation or something like that a couple months of the year, realistically. So how do you think about that and like the future of travel for people who have those two constraints, budget and time?
I think of two main types of trips. ones where you have a lot of flexibility, a vacation that you can take anytime, and a trip where you don't have as much flexibility. Your teacher who can only travel in the summer months, your sister getting married in Bermuda.
Right.
It's those trips where you've got a lot of constraints, a lot of inflexibility, where I think getting the timing of your booking is the most important thing you can do to get a cheap flight. And the way to get the timing of the booking right is to follow what I call the Goldilocks window idea. The idea that your cheap flights pop up not too early, not too late, just right in the middle. For domestic flights, that Goldilocks window is going to be about 1 to 3 months in advance if you're talking about off-peak. But for that teacher who's traveling in those summer months, it's going to be more like 3 to 6 months in advance for those domestic flights.
That's further out than I thought. That's like really planning ahead quite a bit.
And that's just for domestic flights. For international, it's even further. For international peak date travel, you really want to try to be looking 4 to 10 months in advance. That's when you are most likely to see cheap flights. The easy rule of thumb is that if you're hoping to travel in the summer, always book opposite season. So when you're at your New Year's Eve party, that's when you should be thinking about your summer flights. When you're at your 4th of July barbecue, that's when you should be thinking about your Christmas flights. It's not that there's a 0% chance a cheap summer flight will pop up for, in the next few months, but the odds are starting to dwindle.
That's great to know. From your perspective as someone who's, watching these prices go up and down and what's going on in the industry, what needs to change for Boise to have even more deals? Like you're saying that they exist and maybe they're even greater. They're a greater value than deals you'll find even in other major hubs. But what do you think would need to change so that those occur more often?
I think the biggest thing that would need to occur is just more competition between airlines. So more airlines adding cheap flights to and from Boise, and especially more budget airlines coming in, even if you never fly them. Here's the funny thing about an airline like Spirit or Allegiant or Frontier, that even if you never fly budget airlines or ultra low-cost carriers, you still owe them a debt of gratitude for causing cheaper flights on the airlines that you do fly. When researchers have looked at this, they found that when Spirit, for instance, enters a new market, when they start flying, for instance, a route like Boise to, I'm just going to say like Houston, they don't fly that, but if they did, you could expect that airfare across the board from Boise to Houston would drop an average of over 20%. Otherwise, it's mostly depending on airlines offering more kind of system-wide sales. Take this Boise to Jersey in the United Kingdom flight that we keep discussing. I don't think that American Airlines and British Airways I don't think that somebody in the back office really looked and said, there are probably a lot of folks in Boise who really want to go to Jersey and we should offer this at $585.
High demand, yeah.
Right. I think what is much more likely happening there is that they have decided, okay, we have this extra unsold seats on this flight to Jersey. Let's just put it on sale from a lot of different airports. And turns out, so it's available for under $600, not just from Boise, but from Austin, from Baltimore, from Cincinnati, from Denver, from Milwaukee, Los Angeles, from tons of different airports.
I saw an article, Scott, where you mentioned that people plan their vacations backwards. And what do you mean by that? That's such an interesting thought.
100%. And we talked about how the best way to get cheap flights when you are have a specific trip in mind is to get the timing right. But the best way to get a cheap flight if you don't have a specific trip in mind is to plan your trip backwards. Here's what I mean. The normal way that people search for flights is a 3-step process. Step 1, they decide where they want to go. Step 2, they decide when they want to go there. And then step 3, they look, well, what do the flights cost? And by setting price of the flights as the last priority, it's not terribly surprising we end up with some pretty expensive flights. And so instead, what I recommend, look, if cheap flights are a priority, if it's important to you, don't set it as the last step. Set it as the top step. Make it the number 1 priority. Take those same 3 steps and flip it on its head. Step 1, what cheap flights exist right now out of my home airport, out of Boise. There's a flight to Jersey. There's a flight over down to LA under $200. There's this flight over to Denver for $168. And of those places that are cheap, decide which one interests you the most. That's step 2. And then step 3, decide what dates work for your schedule. By setting price as the top priority rather than the last priority, that's how you end up getting cheap flights, and that's how you can afford to take 3 or 4 flights for the same price that you used to pay for one. It might be $1,500 to fly to Paris, but it might only be $500 to fly to Amsterdam or $600 to fly to Brussels. And even if you aren't interested at all in Brussels or Amsterdam, once you get across the ocean, once you get to Europe, just take the train down to Paris. Take a cheap budget flight. It is really easy to get to Paris or wherever your final destination might be.
Scott, thank you so much for making me feel like some international travel and domestic travel that's not super expensive out of the Boise airport is possible.
It is 100% possible. You can do it. It's not going to happen every single day, but most of us are only taking a few trips a year. And so if you just focus on where those cheap flights pop up, I have a complete faith you'll be able to do it.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to planning my next trip. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
That's all for today here on CityCast Boise. And just a heads up, we're celebrating Juneteenth tomorrow, so we won't be in your feed, but we'll be back on Thursday with a guide to the best movie theaters in the Treasure Valley. Catch you then.